You're listening to Niche to Meet You, and this is episode 3 of 4 in our mini-series about wild turkey conservation, in which we meet the ones who made it what it is. I'm Leslie, and it's Niche to Meet You. At this point in the mini-series, I usually pull back the curtain even more on our niche subject. I consider what we've learned about the people who do it, and what the niche feels like and looks like, and we talk to the ones who are at the origins of it. I think that doing this gives us a clearer picture of how something starts, what it started as, and how its evolution has progressed to where it currently stands. It's interesting to see how people bring their own experiences to something and add to the lore. For the last miniseries, we talked to 2 of the original writers of Warhammer 40,000, a sci-fi tabletop wargame written from the tradition of Tolkien and the influence of Dungeons & Dragons. But for wild turkey conservation, we could go back to the mid-1900s when the NWTF formed, and I very well could have taken that approach, told that story. In fact, I fully intended to, but it was in a conversation with Ken Beach, the conservationist from Illinois, where the true origins of this niche began to emerge, and it is much further back than the 1900s.
I really believe the Native Americans are probably the greatest group of conservationists by far. They really worshiped the land and the animals, but they also had to harvest animals to survive, and so they have a really unique perspective.
Historian Brent Rogers talked about this too. His was one of the first interviews I ever conducted.
I think the wild turkey and the American buffalo are 2 of our most iconic species. It's part of our American fabric, and because of that, I think we owe it to those species to make sure that they're maintained. If you look at the Native Americans and you see how important turkeys and buffalo or bison were to their culture, even in terms of their spiritual side of things, there are many ways they were incorporated.
Yes, we have to go back to the very beginning, to the origins of this land that we and the wild turkeys call home, to the traditions of the earliest conservationists whose practices we borrow today. And the expert on this, I'm very happy to tell you, is also a turkey person, and her name is Mary Weakee.
I talk a lot of turkey, believe me. Constantly talking turkey.
I was very excited to meet Mary, and Mary is always excited to talk turkeys. What brings you to talk so much about turkeys?
They're fascinating. They really are an interesting creature. His history, like you said, goes further back than probably science as we know it now is studying them. But I think as a cultural standard use, religious use, there's always been a relationship with humans in that particular bird. All kinds of turkey talking goes on throughout millennia.
Mary is a retired archeologist in New Mexico, and she's a member of the Pueblo Nation. She frequently talks about the native peoples and their relationship to the turkey, which is indeed historic.
In one of my first dig sites, there are human remains, and what intrigued me was the shrouds. Everyone's wrapped in something. Like now, the Pueblo people, we use Pendleton blankets, and prior to that, there were fine linens or rabbit fur or turkey feather blankets, and that was your shroud. To see the very first one, you see a little infant wrapped in it, you're like, wow, okay, that baby was precious. And for them to adorn it the way they did, and to examine that shroud, I wanted to know, first of all, what that blanket was made from. And then to see that it was feathers was impressive. So it started this whole journey. No matter where I went in the Southwest, the turkey was the favored animal to create these beautiful blankets.
And this, the turkey blanket, this is what Mary's known for. After discovering these blankets woven with yucca and stuffed with turkey feathers, Mary's curiosity led her to make a blanket of her own.
I had the opportunity to go out with the Department of Game and Fish and with some biologists that were going to trap some birds, live birds that were invasive to a golf course. And there were Zuni there was Acoma, there were different groups of people who were going to be given these wild birds to release into their reservations. So they had a huge net set up, and here they come, about 38 of them, and they dropped this net, and there was an explosion of feathers. And I was the only crazy lady with a bucket running around trying to pick up all these loose feathers, and they were looking at me like, aren't you going to get a bird? And I was all like, I need these feathers,
As Mary followed the turkeys around with her bucket to collect their feathers, she got especially curious about something that ended up becoming the key to her understanding of the native people's use of the turkey feather.
The biologists captured the birds, and they were all holding them in their arms. I would come behind the rangers, and then I'd lift up the bird's tail, and then I would pull these feathers out, and they just came out, and the bird was relaxed. There was no blood, there was no nothing. So when a predator grabs him, that's how he escapes. In studying them, the bird will grow that feather in 3 days back. Even though you pulled that feather out, he's going to grow another one right away. And then I asked the ornithologist from Comanche Nation. He told me, yes, you're right. All birds bleed. If you were to force a feather out, they wait for the eagles to molt, and then they collect the feathers. So that way, they're not killed for ceremony. In the gathering of turkey, that wasn't it.
This experience set Mary on a path to learn more about the turkey's practical significance in addition to the foundational presence of the bird in her own culture, which she was already very familiar with. The turkey is an extremely important part of the native people's spiritual culture, especially in the southwest of North America.
When they come from South America, from Peru, they're golden. They're beautiful. I've seen them bronze-looking birds. And anything gold, remember, was considered spiritual. So they were worshipped down there. And as they come up, they're traded even further north into the Pueblo systems. And now you see color change because they're eating different food. They're having to adapt to their environment, so they're changing color. They're in a darker forest. And he's still got that bronze and that turquoise green color. He's magnificent looking.
So yes, they're beautiful, but it's not just the beauty that makes the turkey an important part of this culture. There's a practical and poetic reason, too.
We're always constantly praying for rain. Tribes all throughout America, the first thing we ask for is water. We need rain for our plants. So this turkey, when he thumps his wings, it becomes thunder. The dark feathers, they become rain clouds. So when you see some of these feathers on regalia or headdress, those represent like the dark, ominous rain clouds, cumulus nimbus. Again, his whistle, calling of the rain. Certain tribes believe that when he stomped his feet so hard, he created mountain ranges. His power was that immense.
As I'm writing this right now, there's a murmur of thunder outside my studio window. The sky is darkening. Maybe, if I listen closely enough, there might be a turkey call in the distance. We do need rain here in Nashville. My hydrangeas are thirsty. And this power the turkey has to bring the rain, well, that's something the Indigenous peoples valued a great deal.
And again, in the Aztec world, to be considered as a god, how powerful was that bird to them to say that he was a god, that he could be worshipped. These kinds of things reign throughout all, I think, tribal people about this particular bird. We all have stories of who he is, and his feathers are used for prayer sticks or to ask for prayers. We know that the eagle, we consider him the messenger, but this creature that doesn't fly as high as the eagle but lives on the ground, his purpose, I think because he's more closer to the earth and us, he's powerful.
It's almost like an incarnation of deity because he's living among you.
Yes, and these feathers and everything that bird gives it's amazing.
The turkey isn't just a mythical creature no one's seen that represents a phenomenon or acts as a savior. It's a real embodiment of provision and in practical ways, but not in the ways you'd think. After this break, Mary walks us through the practical significance of the wild turkey, and we examine the threads woven in the fabric of the Native American posture toward their surroundings that serve as the groundwork for wild turkey conservation. Be right back. Hey, I hope you've been enjoying our time with Mary in this episode and the whole mini-series about wild turkey conservation. I'm not exaggerating when I say this thing has brought me so much joy. I hope that shows, and I hope you walk away from it changed in a good way. You know how you can help us make this go even further? Share it with 1 or 2 people right now. Just tell them, hey, I love this project, and this is a really interesting mini-series. You might like it too. That is the best way for us to get the word out about Niche to Meet You. Rating, reviews, those are great. Please do it. But telling a friend will help us so much more. Okay? All right. Here's the second half of episode 3. The indigenous spiritual significance of the wild turkey began with its color, that golden color, which signified deity and made it worthy of worship. But if that's all it was, the turkey would never have risen to the level of esteem it did within the southwestern native cultures. It had practical uses, and one might assume that to mean eating. But that's actually not the case.
And they didn't really eat them. You're not seeing very much evidence until the drought. And there was a 35-year drought that hit Mesa Verde and all those villages up in the northern Rio Grande Basin. You would think, as you're digging a hearth, that you would see a lot of turkey, and you don't. Europeans who are used to eating pheasants and doves and game birds consider this wild turkey a game bird, and that's when it starts to become a food source. So, he wasn't eaten like we eat turkey today. He was a very valuable member of your tribe.
A wild turkey flock provides a lot of things to a large number of people. The feathers can be blankets, as we already know, but it can also be regalia and clothing. Turkeys eat insects, which make them an important part of the garden. And then once the bird passes, bones can be used for tools and needles and weaponry and music.
And then the wing bones become musical instruments because they're hollow and they can be made into a whistle or a flute. My grandfather used to have these bones drying on the windowsill, and one day I asked him, hey, why do you save these? Are we going to eat them? And he just looked at me with that grandfather look. And he says, oh no. And he put it to his mouth and he started making this call, like, and what that is, that's a female calling a male.
Remember Billy, who took me hunting in the last episode? He had one of these calls. At the end of our time together, after I stopped recording, he pulled it out to show me. And he called with it, in the middle of a field of cows. Here's the other thing about the wild turkey that endeared the native peoples to it. It's a companion, almost like a dog.
I had a friend that bought chickens, and there was this red turkey in there. And he says, I don't know what this is, such a weird-looking chicken. And I looked and I said, that's a baby turkey. He says, well, should I take it back? I said, no, raise it, see what happens. And that bird rode on that horse with that old man. I'm talking way up in the mountains, and this turkey would jump on the back of that saddle. And sometimes he says, no, we're going too far, you got to stay home. And he would get mad.
That's incredible. When you tally up all the reasons for why the wild turkey was a practical part of this culture, the spiritual significance is easy to understand. And it's also no stretch at all to accept that the native peoples began the wild turkey conservation movement thousands of years before the modern-day conservationists. I feel like it's important to say here that Mary is speaking specifically about the southwestern Indigenous peoples, whose specific subspecies of turkey came up from Mexico, though there is evidence of the same relationship to the turkey in the southeast, where dig sites like at Boiling Springs in Nashville show evidence of domestication and use of bones and feathers in everyday life. And while Native peoples are not a monolith, their individual tribe practices and views are just as diverse as any other cultures. There are some overarching principles in their relationship to the land that are entirely informative of the movement to save the wild turkey in the 1970s. The three principles are rest, respect, and reciprocity. The first one, rest, could maybe even be called restraint. And this was a principle the Native peoples learned through their own relationship with the land.
We give the forests a rest. There's times where there's no hunting, no fishing, nothing, no gathering of plants or anything. And that's always been a traditional intent. It's always been something that's been done by not only by all Native Americans. You know, there's that give everything a time of rest and let it revive itself. Because we've always tried not to over harvest, because that's something that we learned from the past. That's why we ended up moving from place to place, over harvesting over everything, using too much.
The second principle is respect of the land as a whole, knowing how the animals and plants exist together to maintain balance. And this is something Ken Beach has found in his conservation work.
The environment will always win. It may be hundreds of years, but it will self-correct over time through diseases, through things that will bring things more to balance, because it's always looking for that equilibrium balance. And so we just have to learn, and that's where I think, again, the Native Americans have a great concept with the thousands of years that they developed this, I think, of being able to be in balance with nature, and it allows you to continue to harvest and so forth, but you don't want to have big negative impacts on the other side of things. It's all that trying to work toward that balance.
Stephanie Colty is a member of the Tulalip Nation in the Northwest United States. She has a nonprofit to teach younger generations about Native culture and traditions, and to her, it all comes back to balance.
Balance and harmony. Balancing, like when I go harvest, they always say not to take more than what you need. So that way you can save more for other people and to save it for future generations to come. We would go out to harvest the fish, right? And the fishermen wouldn't grab the biggest fish. You would think that they would, right? Like, because that's kind of what we're programmed in Western society to be like, bigger is better. But they said that they don't grab the biggest ones, so that way they can make it to the spawning grounds. Their offspring will make it and continue. And we were okay with having medium-sized fish or even small fish. And I'm sure people or certain tribes probably even preferred it. You know what I mean?
Respect and balance also come into play when you consider the natural order of the environment. Here's Mary Weakee.
Even a mouse, a small mouse that's endangered, he had a beneficial purpose on that landscape. And as soon as he's gone, whatever was invasive or what we thought, it's going to come back and take over. But you got to learn to live side by side with these creatures. And I love that the conservation and wildlife, game and fish, all these entities look at these ways of finding that balance.
The Iroquois Confederacy Constitution, also known as the Great Law of Peace, is an oral history passed down for over 500 years. It established a democracy between 5 Iroquois-speaking tribes. In it, there's the belief that human actions should account for families 7 generations and beyond.
Some things you just hear throughout your life, you got to take care of the 7 generations, next 7 generations, take care of the future. The children are our future.
That's Cindy Yahola, a member of the Creek Nation. She also organizes the Wilson County Powwow in Tennessee.
We've got to invest in our future. We've got to invest in our environment for the future. We've got to invest in the wildlife for our future. You've got to invest in everything and respect everything for us to all have a future.
The third principle is reciprocity, and it underlines the entire posture of the Indigenous people to their surroundings. It's a spiritual principle of understanding that we benefit from the creatures living around us as much as we benefit from their death and consuming them. There's a reverence to this. Stories are passed down through generations about the idea of reciprocity, like this one Stephanie Colty shared with me, that's told in her Tulalip tribe.
A long time ago, there was this village. They'd eat the salmon, and then somebody would tell the kids to go put the bones back into the water. And then there was this rotten boy that wouldn't do it. Instead of throwing them, he goes and throws the bones in a bush. And then a couple days later, they're fishing and they brought fish back and they weren't fully formed, like they had diseases on them, or like half of them were missing, like a trunk got bitten out of one. And the little boy heard what they were talking about, but he didn't care. And he was just going along the river, and then he fell in the water. He was taken by the salmon people. They took him all the way down to the salmon village, and then he got to observe how they lived down below. So one day he was playing with a girl, and then the girl was missing a leg. And so he's like, "Why aren't you whole? Why are you missing a leg?" And then she was like, "Some of the bones didn't come back." The chief told him, "Your people and I have an agreement. We sacrifice our bodies to feed you, and our only request was for you to bring the bone back so that way we can be whole again."
The Indigenous people's spiritual relationship to the land and the inhabitants on it draws them to find practical ways of living that honors the life lost to subsistence hunting.
You know how much to take, you know how much. And every time you take, you give, you pray. You pray or you sing or you give something back to it. And that's just a habit that we all have now.
This reminded me of something that Brent Rogers does. He says a prayer of thanks over every bird he kills. Or like the prayer at the opening luncheon at the National Wild Turkey Federation conference.
Give us wisdom and reverence so to use the resources of nature, that no one may suffer from our abuse of them, and that generations yet to come may continue to praise you for your bounty.
There's an understanding that life is precious, that taking a thing that isn't yours demands your reverence because it has sacrificed itself for your betterment. So how did these principles make their way to a group of hunters in the mid-1900s? Well, I've got a theory, and it may surprise you. I think the bridge was built by Aldo Leopold. Remember him from the last episode? He's one of those conservationist poets, nature writers verging on philosophers like Thoreau. Ken Beach mentioned him as the reason for his shift from hunting to conservation work. But it wasn't the last time I heard Aldo Leopold's name. He kept coming up, and when I dug in, I was shocked.
He was always open to influences from others, being open to other people and listening to other people. That's something that I think he never failed to do throughout the course of his life.
In the next and final episode of this miniseries, we start with Aldo Leopold and use his work to weave the disparate pieces of this story together to form a complete, yet maybe imperfect, argument for why the wild turkey's rescue story and the niche subculture it formed matters for us now, today. Because it absolutely does. We'll see you in the next episode. This project is produced by me with immense help from my editor and blind spot checker, Chris Thiessen. The music you heard was composed by Abigail Flowers and arranged by Zach and Maggie White. Our art is by Rachel Hardiker, and our mastering is by Kevin Morris. You can read more about the Niche to Meet You project and all of the wonderful niche interests we cover at www.nichetomeetyou.show. Thanks for listening.